So I'm going to teach you how to unit test inside of Spring Boot. I'm going to do this quickly and try and cram in as much as what I think you need to know, because let's face it, nobody wants to watch a 40-minute video on unit testing. So let's get right into it. Unit test, written by a programmer, ensures that the prog code does what it's supposed to do. So a unit test isn't the only type of test out there. You've got integration tests, UI tests, and a whole bunch that aren't even on here. Now the reason it's a pyramid and unit tests is at the bottom because they're the cheapest and the easiest to write. So you usually find that a test suite for an application has a whole bunch of unit tests and less as you go up the pyramid. So this application is a typical 3-tier Spring Boot application. At the bottom layer, the persistence layer, we have our repositories for reading and writing from our database. We have our business logic in the middle layer, that's our service layer. And then we have at the top layer, our presentation layer, and that's where all our REST API specific stuff is. I'm going to show you how to write tests for the service layer and for the presentation layer. Because actually the persistence layer is generated for us. We're not writing any code for that, we just write an interface. And that's pretty tricky to test with a unit test. So I'll show you how to do that when we get onto integration tests. So here we are in Postman. I'm going to show you how this REST API works. It has a single endpoint and it's /books with a HTTP get verb. So if I hit this endpoint here, we'll see that we've got some content and it represents our book. So ISBN, title, and then we've got the author associated with that book as well. So there's the author's ID, the name of the author, and the age of the author. And I've got 100 of these in the database for us. So before we look at the service layer, let me show you Jacoco. So I've installed Jacoco on here to show us test coverage. So coverage isn't that great. The big red bars should make that obvious. And we need to change those big red bars to be green bars. Now I've set a minimum requirement on the build for 80% test coverage. But ultimately, if we write tests for our service and our controller, we will hit that 80% test coverage and everything will go green and pass. So here's our book service interface. It has two methods. The first method is list books, and that's taking a pageable and returning a page of books. So this is using the Spring Data JPA pagination. The second method is a little simpler, and it's called get book with youngest author, and it just returns a book. So let's look at the implementation. We can see for list books, we're taking the book repository here, and we're simply calling find all on it, passing in our pageable, and it's just a pass-through method. All we're doing in our service right here is calling the book repository.findAll and returning what it returns. We're not actually doing any business logic, which is the reason I've included the second method. But this is in here as a bit of a contrived example to show you what actual unit testing might be like when you're not just doing pass-throughs. So a bit of a quick overview of the implementation of this method then is we do book repository.findAll to return all of the books, and then we do a bit of stream magic and we sort the stream so that we can get the book with the youngest author. So we're sorting based on the author's age here, and this is just a comparator implementation. We find the first one, which is going to be the book with the youngest author, and then we return that, remembering this is an optional, and if we can't find it, we're just going to return a null. So that's enough of that. Let's write some tests. If we look on the left here, we can see that our test directory mirrors our production directory tree. Now we can see that the controllers directory is empty, as is the services. So here we are with our first test, and this is the one that's testing the list books method, so that pass-through method from earlier. So we need to test book service import as a unit, so we need to either swap out or mock out its collaborators. We're going to mock them out, and we're going to do that using Mockito. So if we take a look up here, we can see the first setup in Mockito. So bar the comment, which is a very helpful comment. We've got this extend with. So this is JUnit 5. So we use this extend with annotation to extend what JUnit 5 can do. And in this case, we're extending it with the Mockito extension because it allows us to use this lovely little pattern here. We've got book repository as an instance variable, private instance variable, and we've got this @mock annotation on it. We can also see we've got book service import, which is called under test because, hey, it's under test. That's private instance variable as well, and this one has inject mocks on it. So by using this extends with Mockito extension, what we can do is declare our book repository as a mock, and then we can have Mockito create that mock for us and then inject it into the book service using these annotations. So we can see on the first line here, we're creating a mock of pageable. Taking a look at this, this is using mockito.mock, which is the normal way that you would create a mock, not the nice way that we've discussed above. Got onto that in a moment. So we can see we've got a mock of pageable. Why do we need that? Because we're simply going to pass that into our test method, but more on that in a moment. We can see here we've got a find all result. So we're basically creating a mock result that's going to be returned from the repository. Creating a new page import, we've got a list, and we are using test data util to create test book A. So basically this is going to return a list of books, and it's going to say that it's only got one book in it. So we've got our mock pageable and we've got our response that's going to come from our repository. What do we do now? Well, we need to set up the mock repository to return that response. Now, the mock repository was set up with that @mock annotation. So if we take a look here, we're saying when book repository.findAll, and it gets that pageable object, that mock pageable, and we want it to return the find all result that we've got here. So we're simply setting up that repository. When the repository is called with the things that I give it, give back the canned response. And now that mock's set up, all we really have to do is call undertest.listBooks and assert that the listbooks result is equal to the find all result. Not a very good test, but it will test the pass through. So let's write a test for that second method that actually has business logic, and I can show you a little better what a unit test is all about. So here's our second method, and this is one that tests actual business logic. So we've got here our expected book. So this method is going to return the book with the youngest author. We need to set up what we expect to be the book with the youngest author. Just so happens that it is test book B inside of our test utility class. So we've got a list here, and we can see that we've got the first element in the list is test book A, which has an older author. And then we have the expected in here, which is the one with the youngest author. We're setting up our book repository mock, say when find all is called, then we want to return the book iterable. So when we call get book with youngest author, we want to assert that the result is not null and is equal to the expected. So with a bit of assert J magic, we've done 2 assertions. It's a separate argument, I suppose, that you should only do 1 assertion per test, but assert J allows you to do it in this way if you so choose. So this test is a pretty alright test. It's going to test that the book with the youngest author is going to be returned. So what we're going to do, let's run this. Hiya, quick interruption. So I'm trying to make software engineering as accessible to as many people as possible, but I do need your help to do that. So if you found today's content useful, be sure to like and subscribe. And if you think someone can benefit from this content, be sure to share it with them. I'm sure they'll thank you, and it would make me very happy. Thank you so much. Okay, so we can see here, we have a build failure. Why do we have a build failure? Well, it looks like the tests have all run and there's no failures. But the reason that we have a build failure is because we are not hitting our 80% test coverage. Coverage checks have not been met. So let's take a look at that Jacoco report. Okay, so there's a little bit more green in there, but it's not all the way. What's not being tested for? So we can see in the comparator here, we are testing the majority of it, but we're not testing this line and we're not testing this line because they're red. So we need to test these lines, and we can do that fairly easily just by manipulating the test data that we pass into our test. All right, so here we are. So I've put in the same book twice. This will be equal and it will return 0. And this I've put after our expected to return 1. So this should test all of the lines of our comparator. Let's run our tests again. Okay, so we have 3 tests run. We have no failures. That's all green. But if we scroll down, we still aren't meeting our lines covered. 0.75, 0.33. It's not 0.80. No good. But let's take a look at our coverage. Okay, we've covered those lines. They are now green. Our test coverage creeps up. Okay, so that is a 91% test coverage on this class. That's pretty good for our service class. Let's take a look at our controller, our presentation layer now. So if you remember from earlier, we said that the controller only has a single endpoint, /books with a HTTP GET mapping. There it is. So we've got list books taking a pageable, then it returns a new response entity, which is basically a page of books. The majority of this logic is stored in the book service. All we're really doing here is we're taking the page of book that's returned, we are wrapping it in a response entity with a HTTP status OK. So let's write a test for this. I'll spare you watching me creating this file because I'm sure you've seen that before. We have 2 tests. The first test tests that our get books endpoint returns a HTTP 200, and we have a second test which tests that list books actually returns books. Now, as much as possible, you want to test one thing per unit test. So the first one checks its response code, and the second one checks its body. Some people would say that you want to have 1 assertion per test. And although I agree with that in principle, sometimes multiple assertions, like 1 or 2, is useful to test the same thing. But assess that on a case-by-case basis. So we have a mock pageable and we have a mock response for our service when we call list books. We're setting up our book service for when list books is called and that pageable is passed in, that it's going to return our canned response. And then we can see there that we're calling list books and we have an assertion that's asserting that the status code is equal to HTTP status OK or HTTP 200. Our second one is fairly similar to the first, but the difference, of course, is we have that assert that in play, which is asserting that the body is equal to the list books result. Let's just run these to make sure that they do pass. Okay, so we can see that the test run is 5, we have 0 failures, and what's more, we have a build success, which means that we've met our minimum test coverage of 80%. We can confirm that by flipping over to Jacoco, and we can see here we have 100% test coverage in our book controller on top of the 90% test coverage we have in our service layer as well. Now we do have a different package in here, which is our domain, which is worth pointing out to you. Now I've decided to exclude the domain from the test coverage calculations. It just so happens to be included in the test report, and the reason being that these are classes simply to represent data structures, and to be honest, the majority of the code in there is generated by Lombok anyway. And there we go, a very quick tutorial on how to write unit tests inside of Spring Boot. Now, if you're pretty new to Spring Boot, do check out this tutorial right here, which is a Spring Boot crash course, which takes you from a complete beginner to being comfortable in the framework. I'll see you over there.